Okay, hello, welcome back. So we will be continuing, or I'll be continuing to talk to you about the legislative history of the environmental movement, so to speak. As you'll see from the next several slides, the Nixon administration not only responsible for NEPA, and by the way, again, the beginning of Earth Day, but also an enormous amount of legislation, perhaps the most important of which is the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act was inspired or prompted by increasing recognition, as Dr. LeCrone, for example, pointed out, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland and other dirty water, poisonous dirty water situations throughout the country. And this legislation was intended to correct those situations. As you can see from the slide, the Clean Water Act regulates discharges of pollutants into the water of the United States. Right? This was something that had not been done. You know of all sorts of examples. The Chesapeake Bay was another pollution in the Chesapeake Bay from farmland and city river runoff and all that kind of stuff. Clean Water Act was intended to address those problems. Okay, just a little more about this. You can see, like in the second paragraph, the second bullet there about wastewater standards. It's a problem, right? What are you going to do with the wastewater, and not just, raw sewage from the household, but also and from businesses, but also stormwater runoff. Again, very impactful on things like the Chesapeake Bay and the Delaware River, the Schuylkill River. The Clean Water Act was a massive, massive intervention in the environment and the environmental issues raised by water. It also, of course, prompted or continued to prompt huge federally funded projects. Sewage treatment projects was a very, very big deal. The Nixon administration was pretty innovative. They were the ones who came up with, or the Nixon administration came up with block grants. So rather than having very specific dollars for very specific programs, you could have larger block grants, which would say to a state or local government, well, okay, so here's a sewage treatment block grant. What are you going to do with it? And if the state and local government's application met with approval, then the money would be distributed to them, and then they could undertake the project. And sewage treatment projects, enormously important, and, for a lot of reasons, right? So, probably the most significant thing environmentally, even though NEPA was so important, is Nixon's creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA was a consolidation of a number of other environmentally related agencies, distributing, for example, those incentive funds I was describing earlier, and also setting standards and doing research and the like. And the EPA kind of combines all of that into one central place. I'd like to think of it maybe like the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after the attacks of 9/11 to consolidate a number of the national security and intelligence agencies. The EPA is sort of the same kind of thing. As we'll see later on, it's become huge, but as I also indicated earlier, it does not act alone. The EPA acts through other agencies at the state and local levels, like New Jersey's Department of Environmental Protection. I'll slow down a little bit. EPA does an enormous amount of research. I would urge you, if you are even marginally interested at this juncture, perhaps take a pause, go online to the EPA site. And there's some really, really interesting things on there. One of the interesting things I'll talk about kind of at the end of this is the fact that the EPA site has been changed since the inauguration of President Trump. And the reason it's been changed, for among other things, right, is the Trump administration not so convinced of the significance of science, of climate change, and of the science behind it and the proposed actions. However, interestingly enough to me, the EPA site has a button on it where you can actually go to see archived web pages from the EPA. Presumably that would mean like from the Obama administration and back. Okay, so the Clean Air Act is especially important for reasons I'll go into in a moment. But one of the things about the Clean Air Act is that it is the most comprehensive air pollution control bill in American history. Air pollution was a terrible problem. If you've seen pictures of Los Angeles and Pittsburgh, or even Allentown and Bethlehem, during the age of the big steel mills and coal burning, there was something called smog, S-M-O-G, and it was very hard to breathe in those cities, and people would be getting sick, getting emphysema and the like because of that. The EPA was responsible for the Clean Air Act. The EPA, I think, is most closely identified with the Clean Air Act. And it actually has become one of the most controversial. You can see sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matters, carbon monoxide, ozone, and lead, and as we will see later on, some other significant things that under the Clean Air Act, the EPA is required to regulate. The Clean Air Act is the first command and control environmental legislation. This is in contrast with what I characterized in the 1960s under President Johnson, the incentivized legislation. In that situation, again, state and local governments and private businesses and industries would act in compliance with environmental standards set by that legislation and the agencies created by it through financial incentives. But what happened, especially under the Clean Air Act, is that Congress wrote a law that said non-compliance with Clean Air Act standards and regulations will result in civil and criminal sanctions, penalties, punishments to both private and governmental polluters. The Clean Air Act sanctions against governments is something that you might be quite familiar with. The sanction of threatening to withhold project dollars from state and local governments who are not in compliance with Clean Air Act standards. And this is the first time that this happened. Again, so command, control. Command, these are the regulations you need to comply with. Control, making sure that you actually do comply. Not just giving you an incentive. You don't have a choice. You have to comply. And if you don't comply and you're a governmental entity, you're going to lose federal funding in that program or in related programs. If you are a private entity, you're going to get civil and criminal penalties imposed on you that you're going to have to pay. They'll be enforced by federal law. The Clean Air Act also was innovative in promoting cooperative federalism, by which we mean, of course, that the national and state/local governments work together to solve problems. So on the one hand, the Clean Air Act is a command and control entity. On the other hand, the EPA actively seeks to involve those state and local agencies to which I was referring before. And this cooperative federalism meant that there would be cooperative work on various kinds of environmentally related projects, so that while there are federal standards for air and for water, state and local environmental agencies can sort of indicate these might be the best ways for us to meet those standards, right? So that you can have variety. And this is something that's true throughout the federal government. Other legislation that's of interest is the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Protect marine mammals such as dolphins and so on and so forth. Again, it's similar to the Endangered Species Act. It's a fairly significant piece of legislation that I just thought it important to mention. So there's a little otter, right? So that little guy is benefiting from that legislation. The Marine Protection and Research Sanctuary Act, the Ocean Dumping Act, right? This is something you can't believe this, but you know, cities, big cities, states, what do you do with all your trash? You put it on a barge, you take it 12 miles out, and you dump it. And New York City was the last city to stop doing that, and that's part of what this legislation was about. Safe Drinking Water Act, right? So you've got the Clean Water Act, you've got Safe Drinking Water Act. So this is focused more directly on the pollutants that could be harmful to human health in the places where the water would actually come from. I've been reading a very, very interesting book or account about a cholera outbreak in 1854 in London. And most people at the time believed that cholera was spread through the air. But there's a couple of people in this one neighborhood, tragically there were so many deaths in this one particular neighborhood. This guy did a lot of research and he figured out that all the people who had died from cholera had drunk water from this one particular pump, which brought water up out of a well in their particular neighborhood. Right? That's how you got your water. And it turns out that somebody had put fecal matter in the ground, and it was totally unregulated. So the good news is, you know, under the Safe Water Drinking Act, we don't have to worry about things like that happening. But you hear about cholera outbreaks in places, you know, like Haiti, for example, after the hurricanes and all the flooding. The fear that that water would be contaminated, it would get into the drinking water supply, which would then get to individuals. The Endangered Species Act. This is an enormously controversial piece of legislation, right? Because what it says is, oh my God, there's a little fish in Tennessee, I always remember this case, the snail darter. And the snail darter only existed in this, and it was in a little fish, and it only existed in this particular area in Tennessee. And in order to protect that snail darter, because if it wasn't protected, it would go out of existence. In order to protect that, lumbering and mining operations were forbidden. Right? So you can imagine these big industries, right? If you think about fracking, you think about the gas lines actually through Delaware County here and actually across the United States. You think about these kinds of issues, and one of the reasons that these things are prohibited is because of protecting these endangered species. And then the whole question becomes, well, why are we protecting individual species? Protecting species is not perhaps, and these are questions that will come up in the ethics section, these are questions perhaps not just because of the species themselves, but because of what diversity of species does for the overall environment. So we'll stop there, okay?